I was about to present my first slot on Newsnight. It was only 2 minutes, but interesting 2 minutes. People watching would have said, wow, 1 or 2 minutes. It was a breaking news story. Huge. They had no choice but to cancel my piece and run the story. Fair enough. Their hands were tied. As understanding as I was also angry. Understandably, so I reckon. I had to release my anger somehow, and I spotted a chair, this black swivel chair, and I shook it, really shook it. A few seconds later, and Jeremy Paxman's breaking this news on air, and all you can see is his forehead. He's sitting in the swivel chair. He carries on like the pro that he is, with these words just coming from the heavens. I never officially got the sack, but the producer pointed right at me after the incident, and then at the exit, so I took that as a sign. Technically I was still on my work experience placement at that point, but they had been so impressed with me, and due to a few others coming down with flu, I was given a chance to shine. What an opportunity. In a week I went from making the tea to making cappuccinos, which is a much tougher discipline, I can tell you. But in that week I captured the minds and imaginations of some very talented people. Can you imagine what I could have done in a month, 6 months, or even a year? Everybody makes mistakes, even Paxman. I remember him accidentally calling Roy Hattersley Roy Mason, but apparently that's not as bad a mistake as mine. When you're at the top, you're allowed to make mistakes, yet when you're starting out, that's a different story. I hope I'm not coming across as bitter, because I'm not. Okay, Newsnight didn't go exactly as planned, but I do have some essential experience behind me now. I got to meet and observe the great Jeremy Paxman at work. What a fine figure of man he is. He's certainly one who knows what he's doing. Jeremy told me to call him Mr. Paxman, being namesakes. I suppose he wanted me to call him Mr. Paxman to avoid confusion. I was Jeremy, he was Mr. Paxman. No one else called him Mr. Paxman, but then they didn't have the same circumstances as me. It was never a case of him disliking me. After the chair incident, he hated me. I mean, he really hated me. But until then, I had seen no signs of dislike. There was the one time where I accidentally called him Jeremy Pac-Man. He didn't like that. We were in the canteen at the time. Not at the same table, but he heard me. The producer he was sitting with did not help when he lined up a few peas and took his Scotch egg and imitated eating the peas with it. Then he grabbed the salt shaker and started chasing the Scotch egg round the table, which was quite bizarre to watch. And let me tell you, Jeremy Paxman does not like being mocked. He argued with the producer for a while before the producer reminded him that I started it, and they both yelled at me. That was unpleasant. But I can say now that I know Jeremy Paxman. I don't have his mobile number or any contact details, but I'm sure if we were to bump into one another, he'd remember me. And not just because of the chair incident. He'll probably mention that first, but then he'd remember that I'm a hard-working professional. I know people now. You know, famous people. And not just Mr. Paxman. There's also Terry Wogan. I wouldn't say I was particularly close to Terry Wogan, but I have met him twice in the same day. I bumped into him in a public toilet. He was leaving as I walked in. He came back because he'd forgotten his gloves. They were resting on top of one of the urinals. I didn't hand it to them. I sort of, nodded at them, I said to him, "You must be relieved." He made a noise, sort of like a chuckle, and said, "Yes," then left. Anyway, about being a professional. It's very important when dealing with callers to rule out the duds, because some will always be idiots. One caller thought he was Jesus, but then he asked if I knew where he could pick up a good bottle of red. Another said he sat on something and got it lodged. I had a milkman call up asking for directions on his round once. I told him where it was. Then he told me to hold on, and then he started asking for directions to the next house on the same street. To be fair, it was a cul-de-sac, and they are notoriously difficult. But these are the sort of corners you have to put up with before you can eventually get someone intellectual. I like corners I can really sink my teeth into. Not literally, of course. The only thing biting on my show is a satire. Which leads me nicely back into professionalism again. For example, I've never sworn on air before. Ever. Shit is not swearing, is it? I was accused of being racist once by a German, no less. After the Holocaust, I don't think the Germans can accuse anyone of being racist. Giles, on the other hand, he has sworn on air. He didn't get in trouble for it, which is probably because no one listens to his show. I mean, he does get more listens than I do, but not really listening like my listeners do. It's like Radio 1. You have it on in the background. No one actually sits down to listen to it. I'll rather have his time slot, sure. Working at the time of night that I do does affect my social life. Of course it does. I can't hang around with my people that I know from university, or at least not for too long because I have to go to work. And yes, they do sometimes call me up on the show to try to wind me up, but they can never wind me up because I always cop on to who it is that's calling. When, for example, a caller wants to talk about the alien they've just seen filling up at a Tesco pump, I know it's one of them. Or if someone calls in and says, "Jeremy, you're a wanker," I'm certain it's someone I know, because people I don't know hardly ever call me that. My time slot often leaves me feeling tired, and can affect my studying. I'm only human. My grades aren't perfect. I wish they were. If you want to make it in the media, you need the piece of paper that says, "Look at me, I'm ready to have my hopes and dreams crushed." Simply being good at broadcasting isn't enough. If it were, my chances of getting a high-end job would be vastly improved. Look at Giles. He's not a better broadcaster than I am. He thinks he is, but he's not. Unfortunately, he is doing better than I am academically, but then he's not held back by his time slot. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate my time slot. It's like a Toyota. Nothing wrong with it. It's reliable and will do what's required. Wouldn't it be nice to have a go in a Porsche sometime? I bet Giles has never had a caller quite like the one I had, who was suspicious of his wife. He thought she was cheating on him, so what he had done earlier that day was to watch her as she left the house. He followed her in his car, saw her meet up with another man and get into his car. It was at this moment that he discovered his own car was leaking oil, which is what the call was actually about. He wasn't worried about his wife. That was just the introduction. Unbelievable. I told him that the situation with his wife seemed to be the more pressing matter, but he was having none of it. Anyway, I handled the call with grace and skill. I highly doubt Giles could have done the same. Any mention of a wife or a girlfriend sends him into a depression about not having one. I did have a girlfriend, but it ended. She said, "It's not you, it's me," which I thought was very good of her to admit. It didn't last as long as either of us would have wanted, and she was really upset about it coming to an end as well. That was the impression I got from her voicemail message. She wasn't in the right place in her life to have a boyfriend. I told her I was in the right place either, as I was actually a lecturer when she called.